Pittsburgh Steeler fans, welcome to the first episode of the Steelers War Room series on YouTube on our new home of Steelers Touch Down Under on the YouTube side, SteelersTDU on the audio side. It's your host of this show, Matty Peverell. It's exciting to be on the channel. Mark and I are really pumped about getting this going. We promised it would be ready by March. We're going, starting kicking this off in February. This is the first episode we're doing of the Steelers War Room series. So instead of getting a weekly Wednesday show, which listeners and fans would be pretty used to, now you basically get all content throughout the week at different stages. So we're going to do some long form short content. We're going to do some short form content. It's just going to be super exciting with what we've got going on. So yeah, just wanted to shout out there in terms of the plans and where this is going forward. So today's show, look, we're going to be very draft and free agency focused between now and sort of, come the end of April. That's what this War Room sort of series is about. It's looking at team and team building, but it's also about stats and salary cap and those sorts of things too. So it's a real mixed bag, licorice all sorts, to want of a better term. And over the weekend, I was just doing some background into a few cool topics that I was thinking about covering. And I found out a shocking truth about the Steelers. Now, it depends, I guess, on how shocking it is in terms of what each Steeler fan thinks about the Steelers when it comes to their sacks and their sack record, how good a sack team they are. But I certainly think over the last few years, we've got this narrative that's built around the Steelers getting 50-plus sacks in a year. They didn't do that last year. And, and what that means in terms of the steel curtain and going back to the 70s and the 80s and Kevin Green in the 90s. I think as a Steeler fan, you just immediately think of hard-nosed defense. You think we're in the sack, we're amongst the sack leaders. And yes, TJ Watt's done really, really well. Yes, Kevin Green retired, third on the all-time list, and we'll have a look at both those things in a moment. But actually, as a team, the Steelers historically have not done that well, or they're only about halfway in the league. They're not even in the top 10 in the league in terms of what they've done across a number of statistical areas when it comes to sacks. And why is this important? Well, it's really important because if you think about TJ Watt, and we missed him last year, you think about Alex Highsmith and what he was able to do this year with 14 and a half sacks, and the fact he's coming off contract at the end of this year. And so the Steelers probably want to re-sign him. The idea of having two sack leaders for the Steelers is actually a big deal because when you look at some of the historical data, actually it would suggest that we relied on one guy, and relying on one guy is great if that guy's going to be defensive player of the year in, year out. But it's really hard if that guy goes down and gets injured. And that's what we saw this year in the season of 2022. And it's something we probably want to fix going into 2023. So let's sort of kick it off. I guess one of the great places to look to begin with is the official leaders and the unofficial leaders. So we're going to talk about a bunch of data on this show, all brought to you by Pro Football Reference and actually a service they have that I pay for called StatHead, which allows you to basically look at a bunch of different criteria. It gets pretty nerdy and pretty geeky, but there's some cool stuff you can do. Even the comparison tool in that is pretty enhanced. So we're going to definitely use that a lot on this Steelers War Room series. And I thought I'd show it on the visual side, but those listening on audio on, Apple, Spotify, Anchor, at SteelersTDU, you're not going to be disadvantaged either. All right. So officially, because the sacks were recorded as an official league stat from 1982, officially, according to Pro Football Reference, the leader in a season is Michael Strahan with 22 and a half, and there's TJ Watt. Now, as a Steel fan, you sit there and you say, that's a load of crap. It's actually TJ Watt. The league did him injustice with that penalty. I think it was Patrick McCarry, and then the mistake in the snap that he had and all those sorts of things. Well, regardless, they're tied there, Michael Strahan and TJ Watt. Unofficially, though, because what they've been able to do with Pro Football Reference, and there's I know there's one guy that puts up all the old Steeler video, games for you to watch. They've actually gone back and done all the stats up and looked at sacks off tape. And there's people that they've hired to do this and all this sort of thing. But basically, unofficially, Al Baker had 23 sacks in 1978, the Detroit pass rusher there. And so, you sort of get a different sort of feel. The thing that I think is really different is you got a guy like Deacon Jones here that played for the Rams. I mean, in the 60s, even my parents were young. And so, for me, I certainly haven't seen any Deacon Jones play. But Deacon Jones clearly as a pass rusher is really up there. He had 3 seasons above 21 sacks if you go back and count them. So there's some pretty crazy things. But this is where we get the first myth, right? The first myth amongst I guess, Steeler fans potentially, or at least amongst myself, in terms of what the Steelers sacks look like. The Steelers don't have, other than TJ Watt, anyone in like the top 20 that's ever played in terms of sacks for the Steelers in a single season. So even when you think about you think about Justin Harrison, like 16 and a half sacks. That's in the top. That's just outside the top 50. Now, Joey Porter's in there from his season in Miami since 2008, but that's not with the Steelers. So that's where it gets really interesting from that perspective. I also use this argument, I said Justin Harrison before. He was a famous Australian rugby player. James Harrison is who I meant with his 16 sacks. But it's just pretty crazy when you start to look at this. So myth number 1 is that the Steelers are perennially in there as sack leaders. Well, kind of they're not. They've only had one guy that's even in the top 50 in terms of single season performance. So myth number 1. All right, let's look at overall career. So we looked at that there. Again, I'm talking about top 50 all time, but even when you start looking at the top 100, as I'm going through this list right now, the Steelers are pretty absent. Now, Kevin Green had 1988, 1999. He had 16 and a half both of those years. That's 80 and 81st all-time performance in a single season. That's pretty cool, but none of that's with the Steelers, even though he went into the Hall of Fame as a Steeler. Joe Porter, Miami, we talked about that with the 18 sacks. So again, you look at the top 100, and apart from TJ's season, we actually don't have anyone else in there. I'm just making sure that's dead correct. Oh, we have Gene Lipscomb. I lie. I have Gene Lipscomb. That was the guy I wanted to bring up. Gene Lipscomb there. Pretty crazy, go back to the 60s. But again, it's not actually official there in the record books. So if you trust Pro Football Reference like I do, you trust their tool StatHead, you can talk about Gene Lipscomb there in the 60s. And he had a pretty cool thing. I actually we might get there in talking a little bit about Gene Lipscomb because I sort of found him quite an interesting guy as I was looking through this, and his name sort of cropped up a little bit. So we might go into that. But he had a 17 and a half sack season, if the numbers are correct, 61. So pretty incredible from that perspective. But as I say, myth number 2 there is that the Steelers have a sack leader in there all the time. They don't. You know the other cool thing? I searched this tool, I did 1,080 players that have had a season with 10 sacks or better. 10 sacks or better. Now, the interesting thing out of all of that, Michael Strahan and Al Baker, the 2 leaders, if you go off the unofficial stats, were both drafted around at pick 40. I kind of find that really interesting. There's 2 guys in that, and that's the way it works. That's from that. The Steelers have some perennial sack leader every single time. Now, do a quick little jump into Lipscomb. Daddy, born 1931. He had 13 and a half sacks in his career, so he played 100 games. But he sort of had these 17 and 7 after that. He didn't do anything before that when he was in Baltimore. But that's sort of Gene Lipscomb, this 60s sack for the Steelers. All right. Moving on to NFL sack leaders. Again, we were talking before about the official and unofficial sack leaders for a single season. Now we're going to talk about unofficial leaders and official leaders across their career. Again, this is an area where you look at the list, you assume the Steelers are going to have multiple players. But now, error, not true. Actually, yeah, they really now, if you look across all active players, the Steelers don't have anyone in the top 10. Now, Cam Hayward is sitting there at 82. I think he's number 12 of all active players right now. Now, Cam has probably got 2 or 3 years left. Let's say he's got 20 sacks there. He gets almost to that 100 sack amount. That'll rocket him up, right? That'll get him into pretty plus the top 50 all time, right? That probably gets the Cam fans a big one, even without a ring. So that's pretty positive. Now, TJ will be in the top 20 sack leaders, I would hope, bar a career-ending injury, and touch wood, that doesn't happen at all ever in his career. But TJ Watt, is someone that has that potential that in, 6 seasons is literally, now in the top 100 all-time sack leaders. And we've got Cameron Hayward there. But when you look through it, like, the Steelers just don't have those players. Now, Joey Porter is up there. But as you saw when we showed the stats before, at least almost, I think it's a quarter of his sacks, or at least a fifth of his sacks minimum, came for a different team from Miami. Minimum of a fifth. I think it's more like a fourth or third of his sacks when you go through it. So I'm talking about guys that are just like pure Steelers all the way through. We talk about Kevin Green. Obviously, he got a number of sacks with the Rams that he didn't get with the Steelers. Kevin Green is third all time in terms of sacks with 160. That's official leaders. He's fourth unofficial. You sort of move through there and differences of what that is. But even if you look at Joe Green on the unofficial stats, Joe Green's actually behind one sack ahead of TJ Watt. Oh, he's equal to TJ Watt. You've got LC Greenwood there, obviously, as well. So you've got a number of guys in the top 150, which is pretty good. But you don't have that top 100 or many in the top 50. And certainly not guys that have played for the Steelers the whole career. And I think that's kind of that's another stat that at least shocked me as a Steelers fan. I didn't expect to see more there. Maybe I should dive into this list more often. Maybe I should have dived into it before. But that's sort of the way I saw it. So pretty crazy from there. And I just appreciate like all the raids. I think it's pretty cool to have everyone here from Steelers Nation Australia that's streaming on the XFL. That's Mark's channel. So you got to go check that out. They're really fun from the XFL. You guys are lucky to have someone stream on the XFL side of things. Really, really cool. All right. So that's myth number 2. Steelers have a bunch of guys that are the best all-time sack leaders. We're gonna crush that one. All right. Now to go on to team streak. So much has been made of the Steelers, as I said earlier, having multiple seasons of 50 sacks or more in a season and being the sack leader. So I expected when you go in and you look at the most consecutive number of games for sacks, that the Steelers, at least over the last few years, would be in there. But now, myth wrong. Now, the Steelers are fifth all time with 10 sacks right here. You can see this. I'm not making this up. I'm showing you on the screen right now, which I think is affecting my connection a little bit. But 10 sacks, they had a streak of 10 sacks in a row, started in 1974 in October, finished in December. But it's a long time between drinks if you look after that. Now, admittedly, there are only 25 teams that have had a streak of 8 games in a row with sacks right now. It's a pretty hard thing to keep up. There's only about 25 teams that have, about 28 teams that have had 7 sacks in a row. So it is pretty interesting. The 2019 team, they had 6 there in 2019 between October, going in from the final finish to the season. Remember how good that defense was that almost got the Steelers into the playoffs, and then going into 2020. But that's split over a season and a bit technically. Now in 2004, they had another streak of 6. And that sort of started in October, finished at the end of November. They had another streak in 2001, another streak in 1994. So it's not that the Steelers aren't out of it, but again, when you look at let's call it top 50 in terms of performances in a season, in terms of, and in this case, we're looking at consecutive numbers of sacks. And yes, I appreciate the Steelers there in the top 5. Steelers are really actually quite out of it. And it's kind of funny because you think about 50 sacks in a season, you think about 16 games, you need to average three a game in a 16-game schedule, more than 3 a game to finish with plus 50 sacks. That's what you got to average. So you're relying on games of 5, 6, 4 sacks, and then you might have a game with none. So, Yeah, I think it's just a pretty crazy thing to think about. And I think for me, if the Steelers can get back up to 50 sacks, I think I'm going to appreciate that a lot more than what I did previously. I think I took it for granted that the Steelers and Blitzburg and sacks, and this was just the steal away. Now, yes, this year we didn't get to 50 sacks, but yes, this year we led in the NFL in interceptions. So it's, kind of pick your poison sort of defense. But as I said, this shows more about sack leadership and Steelers sack leadership and myth busting. And it's just a kind of interesting concept that we've got around here, instead of like with the Steelers and then sack leadership. And I think what's interesting as well that stuck out to me is Philadelphia are really up there. Now, you had that this year, obviously went to the Super Bowl and lost to the Kansas City Chiefs. They had 10 sacks. They had 10 sacks in 1993. They had 8 sacks in 1987. They had 9 sacks in 1986. So Philadelphia are up to a Pennsylvania rival and in the NFC. They really had a sack leadership here that I didn't expect. Same as Dallas and Detroit. They were kind of up here as well. I didn't expect them to have that leadership. And I'd love to probably go back and do a deep dive over the next few months around the correlation between sack leaders as individual players and sack leaders, in terms of teams and the teams they played for. But it is kind of interesting to see this correlation that exists. Okay, so continuing to move on. Now I wanted to look at the team stats. Well, we're going to look at team seasons by sacks. So who has had the most sacks? This is the myth that opened up the can of worms for me. Absolutely opened up. Like, I had a thing in here that apart from the Chicago Bears in the 80s, the Steelers are going to have a bunch of seasons in the top 10 to 20. That's what I thought. Oh boy, was I wrong. Right. So the NFL record of most sacks in a season is 72 by the Chicago Bears, right? The Chicago Bears in 1984. 72. The Minnesota Vikings in 1989 had 71. I think there's Jared Allen on those teams. Philadelphia, there we go again with 70. You had the 1987 Bears with 70 sacks. And remember, some of these, these games, they're all 16. Obviously, Philly had 17 games with the 70 sacks they had this season. But Oakland are up there with 14 games in 67. Although remember, that's unofficial stats because sacks only started getting recorded from 1982, as I said before. So you even get to San Diego had a good team in 2006. They had Merriman and Sean Phillips. But you got to go all the way down before you get your first Pitt season to 56 sacks in 2017. Now, we know when the Steelers had those, I think it was 4 seasons for 50 sacks or more. They had 56 in 2017. They had 56 in 2020. They're good numbers back to back. They're pretty good. Now, they're 36 and 37th all time there. Philadelphia, there you go again with they're in there as well with the same number in terms of all time. You then go to 55 sacks in 2001. They had 55 sacks again in 1994. And then to the last one, so then in 2008, the Super Bowl, they had 51 sacks. That's 77th all time. They're 86 in 1996, which is 86 all time list. They had 51 sacks again. And then they had 50 sacks in 1983. That's record number 101. They had 50 sacks in 2002. That's 98th all time. So the Steelers are in there multiple times in the top 100 season team performances on a season for terms of sacks. I guess I just expected them to have multiple years where they were in the top 10 to 20. And maybe that was unfair expectation from my part. There's only been 22 times a team has had 60 sacks or more. But Steelers aren't one of them. And it just surprised me. Then you look at teams that have had 55 sacks or more. Now, there are basically 54 teams that have done this, and the Steelers are in there 4 times. That's pretty cool. Don't get me wrong. That's pretty cool, particularly when you look at the number of teams in the league, like 32. If they've all had 2 of them, that'd be 64. The Steelers have done it 4 times. So they've had them more than their fair share. But the Steelers still haven't had over 60 sacks. And as I said, it kind of surprised me. And what it said to me, particularly when I looked at this number, and I've kind of done a back to front into how I looked at this for you guys, because I want to just sort of let you see the case as it builds for why Steeler fans might have a bit of a misconception. There might be some myths here of what you think about the Steelers and their leadership in the NFL in terms of sacks. I start here and went, okay, wow, the Steelers' performance haven't done that great. They've got some guys in the top 100, top 150 all-time sack leaders. They don't have guys that have done that only with the Steelers throughout their career, or even have had some of their best seasons with the Steelers in their career. Although Cam Hayward and TJ Watt will help change this narrative, particularly if you keep Highsmith. And as I said, some of this got me thinking about the importance of retaining Highsmith. But you look at the team number of sacks, it's definitely the myths busted there. You then look at the leadership, the myths busted there. And it's just, as I say, a really interesting sort of situation to sit back and think as a Steeler fan, how do we improve this? And when I think about the Steelers in 2022 and where they need to go into 2023, it's a really interesting situation. It's not just about re-signing, Highsmith, Alex Highsmith. It's about what are we doing around Highsmith? What are we doing around the middle linebacker position or inside linebacker position? What are we doing about blitzing safeties? How are you going to use Terrell Edmonds differently? And even to an extent, what is the loss of a Mike Hilton style cornerback that can come off the line and shut down the run and put pressure on the quarterback, particularly scrambling quarterback? These are some really interesting things because the Steelers can address some of these areas in the draft and free agency. They can go get a tackling cornerback. They can go get whether that's in the draft or free agency. They can go get safeties going to come in and slam down the box in dime packages and put pressure on the quarterback, particularly a guy like J.L. Skinner from the Boise State in the draft, probably second or third rounder, or Sidney Brown from Illinois, but I think he's going early in the second, and that's even pre-combine. And re-signing Alex Highsmith. There's some of the tricks and tools that the Steelers can use to move and change this situation that they've got, relying on one guy for sacks all the time. And the sacks on their season, their sacks historically will get better. But yeah, really interesting situation. Just a few myths that I wanted to bust. As I said, maybe it wasn't a myth for you. Maybe you knew, but I shocked kind of myself, and I thought it was kind of interesting because Steelers fans, we go out there thinking we've got this, the Steelers have this reputation or this, leadership when it comes to the sacks in the NFL, and it's Blitzburg, and we know the defense better than anyone else. And yes, sacks don't correlate to wins every single game. It's like the whole Big Ben conundrum of, does he need to throw 50 passes and 500 yards? Because if he is, we're probably going to lose the game. Or we will have lost the game by the time he's throwing half of those stats. But with that, that's going to wrap up this first episode in the Steelers War Room series on Touchdown Under. I'm Matty Peveril. If you like the show, hit the like button, click the bell icon, get the notifications, subscribe. If you're on the audio side, hope you're downloading the shows regularly. We're there on Apple, Spotify. Just look at SteelersTDU as well. Really excited to be a part of, we're working with Mark and this new venture we're doing. It's all designed to give you more content at more times. And yeah, as always, go Steelers.